Hello my friends and welcome back to the channel. Today is Wednesday, the 6th of November, and it looks like Donald Trump has won the US election. He will be the 47th president of the United States. Now, how is that related to the topic of this video? Well, that's very simple. You know, he's been very outspoken with regards to the conflict in Ukraine, and he promised on numerous times that he will stop the conflict. Personally, I have my reservations regarding that, because stopping something as big as this conflict, it will take a lot of willpower and a lot of cogs will have to be set in motion. Cogs which are part of the same machine. I found an article 2 days ago. It was published on the 4th of November in the evening by Ukrainska Pravda, but basically the source is Radio Free Europe. Now, I know what you're thinking right now. Well, everything that comes from Radio Free Europe should be taken with a heavy dose of salt, and I would agree to that. But this one is absolutely true. This is the draft agreement that has been initialed by both Russia and Ukraine in Istanbul of 2022. And what I want to do is go over it point by point and see what's realistic and which parts of this draft agreement would be achievable today, especially if Donald Trump has the willingness to actually deliver on his promise. So let's go over this one. We're not going to cover the entire draft because it's about 10 pages or so, but I have a very short summary and I want to address these points because I think some of these are definitely doable today. Some of them, maybe not, but let's have a look. After invading Ukraine, Russia offered peace deal resembling demand to surrender, says Radio Free Liberty. I agree with the title entirely because I've read the entire thing, and yes, it does indeed resemble a demand to surrender. But that's what happens when you lose on the battlefield. Consider this, everything that we're about to see in here, this is what Ukraine could have had in 2022, before all this madness even really properly started. The Kremlin demanded that Ukraine's army be reduced to 50,000 troops, including 1,500 officers. The country would also have had only 4 ships, 55 helicopters, and 300 tanks. And those numbers will still be close to what the United Kingdom has today. Now sure, the UK has more ships and more helicopters, but the point is, manpower-wise, what the terms that Russia offered Ukraine would have still left them with a similar army to what the UK has. And that's after the demand to surrender, just to keep things in perspective. Now, why is it necessary for the Russians to demand that Ukraine has a much lower army or a much fewer numbers? Well, I think that's self-explanatory. They've proven that after 2014, after Maidan, that Russia needs to be extremely wary of what Ukraine has in terms of military capability. Because as it turns out, well, it didn't turn out that well, did it? In addition, Ukraine was to undertake not to develop, produce, purchase, or deploy on its territory missile weapons with a range of more than 250 kilometers. Radio Liberty notes that this is the distance that separates the Crimean Bridge from the Ukrainian-controlled city of Huliapole in Zaporizhia Oblast. And that's fair enough, because the Crimean Bridge is a key part of the Russian infrastructure, a part that links Russia and Ukraine. They cannot allow that bridge to be unprotected. And the best protection is to ensure that your enemy does not have the range to hit it. Now, that doesn't mean they're not going to try to take it down, because we've seen that happening. Do you remember the truck incident? I'm going to flash it on the screen just to re-jog our memories. Yeah, exactly that. So this stipulation, I'm not surprised at all by it. Russia also reserved the right to ban Ukraine from using any other types of weapons that may be deployed as a result of scientific research in the future. Wrong. That is wrong. That's not what the draft says. I've read it. What the draft says is that Russia reserves the right to ban future long-range weapons if they exceed 250 kilometers. But of course, Radio Free Europe has to be Radio Free Europe. And Ukrainska Pravda says, well, thank you for omitting that, because now we can omit it as well. No, basically, Russia didn't want Ukraine to have weapons, any type of weapons, that go beyond 250 kilometers. And they reserve the right, in the draft of course, in an alternate reality, they reserve the right to ban future weapons that can actually exceed that distance. But everything that's below that, that's fair game. Russia made no stipulations regarding that. Let's remember, people, Russia doesn't want a rump Ukraine on its borders. No country wants other rump states at their borders, because that's not how you prosper. From Russia's perspective, economic and otherwise, it's worthwhile for them to have a decent, strong, prospering Ukraine at their borders. When your neighbors prosper, you prosper. That's the general rule of thumb. Not always, but in most cases. If Ukraine does poorly, then Russia needs to step in to help. Under the agreement, Ukraine would have had to recognize the independence of the so-called Donetsk and Luhansk People's Republics within the administrative borders of the Donetsk and Luhansk Oblasts. Ukraine would also have had to rebuild Donbass infrastructure destroyed since 2014 at its own expense. Well, the first thing I'll call out is why do you have to mention Donbass and Luhansk as so-called? They're not so-called. Do you remember Kosovo? It was fine over there, wasn't it? Kosovo? Oh, we have to respect the right of Kosovo. We have to respect the right of Kosovo. How about here? It's the same exact situation, but this just exposes the hypocrisy, the double standards, and the double speak of the West. It's fine for one, but it's not fine for the other. And what's the determining factor? Our wish, our desire. Do we wish to recognize this? Yes. Well, in that case, it's fine. It's fully democratic. It's all about the people, Jimmy. Think of the people. Well, how about here? Well, no. That's not about the people. That's about the Russians, those pesky Russians. These are the measuring units, my friend. That's it. Also, let's point out the fact that Radio Free Europe seems to be outraged that Russia demanded that Ukraine rebuilds Donbass and its infrastructure that has been destroyed since 2014. Why is that so outrageous? I just don't see it. After Maidan happened in 2014, Ukraine started to lob shells every day and every other week and every week and destroying infrastructure and injuring people. I think if you break something, the rule is you buy it. You go into a store, you play with an expensive camera, and the owner says, well, if you break it, you buy it. It's that simple. That's how it works. But they seem to be outraged. Also, let's look at Mariupol. Has Ukraine destroyed Mariupol? No. Russia destroyed Mariupol at the start of the invasion. So what did Russia do? Have they demanded that the West and Ukraine rebuild it? No. They haven't said a single pipsqueak. They've started rebuilding it themselves. Why? Because they destroyed it. It's very simple and very logical. It's not when your Radio Free Europe and Ukrainska Pravda and the BBC and all of these. That's when things start to be less rational. The Russian Federation's demands, including the lifting of all sanctions, both Ukrainian and international, imposed on Russia, as well as the withdrawal of all international lawsuits filed since 2014 and the reinstatement of all property rights of the Ukrainian Orthodox Church of the Moscow Patriarchate. As you can see, I've split this paragraph in half because it's very long and it addresses a lot of points. So let's start with the pink part, the lifting of the sanctions. Well, that's something that I don't think that Russia and Ukraine can bilaterally agree upon. Let me explain. Yes, some of the sanctions have been imposed by Ukraine, but those are the sanctions that nobody cares about, the least of all Russia. Ukraine has no financial power to hold over Russia. So the sanctions that Ukraine has imposed, I don't think the Russians care about at all. However, the sanctions that really hurt Russia have been imposed by the West, and that's something that Russia and Ukraine cannot agree upon. Russia will need to conduct separate talks with NATO, with the EU, with the United States, and with all of these countries, even on a bilateral basis, in order to agree on something. So, bottom line, I genuinely don't believe, I don't care what anybody says, I don't think the West will ever remove all of the sanctions. It's just impossible. They won't do it. First, because they don't want to, and the second, imagine the titanic work that would have to be involved to remove even a few sanctions. Because these people in the EU, especially the ones in the EU, they've gone at length to sanction the Russian economy. The files are probably this thick, and there's probably about 1,000 of them. Do you think they're gonna go back and undo all of that? It's just impossible. And the more time goes on, or the more time goes by, it's getting harder and harder to remove the sanctions. Let's move on to the next point. The property rights of the Ukrainian Orthodox Church of the Moscow Patriarchate. This is something that I believe we're all familiar with. We know that Zelensky has banned pretty much everything that had to do with the Moscow Patriarchate. I don't think that's a good idea. I don't think religion should ever be brought into the conversation. So the fact that that part is there, I think it's just fair enough. The agreement demanded that Ukraine lift all bans and introduce no further bans on symbols associated in the states with the victory over Nazism, which meant the de facto legalization of Soviet and communist symbols in Ukraine. Russia also insisted that Russian be recognized as an official language in Ukraine. Well, there's two separate things in there, so let's start with the easier one. Russian being an official language in Ukraine. Personally, I have no opinion regarding that one way or another, but here are the facts. Over 40% of the population living in Ukraine does indeed speak Russian. And Russian also used to be a language that was acceptable in schools, in public institutions, in state institutions, up until 2014, when the Maidan happened. So, I think that's what they mean by being an official language. If you have people, and you do have a lot of people who speak Russian, then those children, what kind of education will they get if they're not allowed education in those languages? Hungary had the same problem with that. So did the Romanians who live in the very southwest of Ukraine. This didn't used to be a problem up until the Maidan, but apparently now it is. So that stipulation is not something new, it's just going back to the way it's always been. Then now let's address the longer bit. The symbols, the communist symbols. So apparently, Radio Free Europe, they have a problem with the sickle and the hammer. But they're totally fine given the symbols that do exist in Ukraine today. Those are fine, and I think we all know what symbols we're talking about here. They're fine with that. I don't see a single media outlet being outraged at the symbols that we see in Ukraine today. Nobody speaks about that, not a single pipsqueak, even though the internet is full of images. And it's not just the symbols, my friend. I'm not talking here about graffiti on a wall type of symbols. I'm talking here about entire behaviors symbolizing those things. But they seem to be fine with that. Now, I'm sure if you ask them, they say, no, we're not fine with that. Okay, well then why don't you speak out? Why do you keep giving them money? There's a lot of things that go on over there that the media is fully silent or completely silent on. But when the Russians want something, it's something big, it has to be in the center of the attention and scrutinized. Because those communist symbols, those are the dangers. No, those are not the dangers. Why? How do we know that? Well, they haven't really caused any problems since the fall of the Soviet Union. NATO, on the other hand, NATO has a symbol that's not really... is not really projected in the media a lot, but that's the symbol that has expanded the most since 1991. Maybe someone should take a look at that symbol. My friends, just to wrap things up, basically what the Russians want is to ensure that Ukraine doesn't have the long-range capabilities to hit Russia in the future. Also, they want Ukraine to recognize the People's Republics of Luhansk and Donetsk. That's one point, by the way, which the media has a big problem with. Also, the lifting of all sanctions. Again, personally, just my personal opinion, I don't think that's gonna happen. Yes, some sanctions might and will get lifted, of course, but the majority of them, I think, are there to stay. Also, another big point is regarding the Moscow Patriarchate. I think that's something that can easily be done, and that would not be a point of contention from the West. Now let's see what a Ukrainian official said about this draft. Quote, had the Ukrainian authorities accepted these conditions, it would have turned Ukraine into a puppet entity with a nominal neutral status, with a tiny toothless army, devoid of NATO protection, and with no chance of regaining control over Crimea or Donbass. Ukraine would have been forced to recognize the independence of Donetsk and Luhansk Oblast in their entirety, as well as large territories that were still under Kiev's control at that time. Well, a lot of those territories that he's speaking about at the very end, those are probably no longer under Kiev control at this time. So what changed? Well, 2 more years have gone by, a lot of lives have been lost, and you ended up in the same position where you could have been 2 years ago, with a lot less loss of life, a lot less selling your country to the Western corporation. Point being, my friends, they're speaking about a toothless army. Well, like I said, that army looks very much in the ballpark of the United Kingdom. Are you saying that the UK has a toothless army? Or Germany? Or Romania? I hope that's not what you're implying. Okay. I think their biggest point is to do with Crimea and with NATO. They say, devoid of NATO protection. You won't need protection because there's no one to attack you. Why do you need protection? You see, NATO is only there to protect you from the troubles they get you in. That's why NATO exists, my friends. But I leave it here. Let me know what you think in the comments down below, and I will see you in the next episode, my friends. Take care and bye-bye.